Alright, Augie, after an entire year, we're back.
I'm sure the viewers are happy to see my charm and charisma again into the living rooms.
Shut up, Augie. Your face by itself could be an entire Halloween episode. The shameless gall to think that your sight isn't sodomizing people's eyeballs shows why you failed a chromosome test. Now, today we're going to do an autumn vintage theme episode with some character and charm. Let the vintage magic commence. You see, it's like one of those classy Fred Astaire movies.
Would you like me to do a dance?
No, I don't. The only time I would want to see you dance is in front of a moving bus. The vintage look. The rose-colored glasses, how we see movies in the past. So vintage lenses are usually an interest to many working-class filmmakers who are tired of jerking off to camera spec sheets. And since most filmmakers are awkward geeks, those spec sheets probably shattered. So I present to you the 3 best vintage 35mm lenses that I would recommend. And we will find out who would be the winner that deserves your cold hard cash that otherwise would have gone to another OnlyFans payment. The first lens is the Zeiss Jena Flektagon 35mm F2.4. A 1970s East German commie lens. It is made of metal, but feels flimsy like commie metal. However, it's quite well made. German commie isn't the same as Eastern European commie. It has the red multicolored signatures, which is the best version according to forums that are big into placebo effects. It has an auto feature, which I have no clue what it does. It does have the longest focus throw that I have seen on any vintage lens. That will make it quite easy for focusing. And focus you shall, since it's a quite sharp lens. And sharp lens you will, since I can't think of a way to finish this sentence. The following footage is shot with the Flektagon 35mm f2.4. One thing you will notice is that the footage looks as brand new as 10-year-old French soap. The image is contrasty and vibrant. You almost think you're looking at a modern lens with modern coating and glass. Even the bokeh has an almost modern feel with its 6 aperture blades. Its multicolored coating avoids that the colors get faded in the broad sunlight. Perhaps the first time that communists didn't mess up something. The next lens is the Steinheil 35mm f2.8, a West German vintage lens from 1957. Unlike the Flektagon, which is an M42 mount, the Quinaron is an exacta mount. You can buy the Quinaron in chrome or the more common cheaper zebra version. Image quality should be the same. This chrome one, it's full metal and actually nicely made. Its focus pull is as smooth as the waxed legs on a looped chicken that has been dipped in butter and wrapped in velvet and shipped to a town in Smoothakistan. Its manual aperture is somewhat tricky to operate. You have to pull that silver knob that looks like Robocop's hemorrhoid and then press that switch next to it. I stumbled on that lens when researching lens forums, and one of the nerds sold his Leica R35mm f2 and f2.8 lenses after buying the Quinaron. So after seeing the rendering and bokeh on Flickr, I had to buy it. Also, when buying the exact mount, get the black one instead of the silver one. The following footage was shot on the Quinaron 35mm f2.8. There's something very pleasant about the rendering, a kind of very clean vintage, where there's a balance of sharpness and painterly patterns. It's hard to quantify, but when you see it, you know what you're looking at. It's almost like a vintage Leica, without the gagging stench of fat sex tourism. When you look at the bokeh of the Quinaron, you can detect a slight swirl, but it's tastefully done compared to the swirls you get from a Helios 44-2, which depending on the scene can be as distracting as a rusty thumbtack up your pee hole. The next lens is the Japanese Takumar 35mm f2.3 from the 60s. And unlike the Super Takumar f2 variant, it's larger but doesn't come with radiation. It's very well built out of metal. The focus pull isn't as long as the German competitors, but it's smooth. It has a silver Megatron hemorrhoid switch that most likely has something to do with its auto mechanism origin from the film camera it's from. I know nothing about film cameras, nor do I care to. So all I will say is that for digital use, it's irrelevant. If you do push the auto switch, you have to make sure to press the little pin that's right next to the rear lens at the back. That switch freezes the apertures, which is not what you want. The pin releases it again. The following footage is shot with the Auto-Quinaron 35mm f2.3. Of all the lenses I own, or researched, this is the most artsy 35mm I've ever seen. In strong light the colors are faded, but it is capable of vibrancy and contrast. This lens is as painterly as a Dutch guy inhaling turpentine and is stuffing his butthole with cocaine using a filbert brush. Its bokeh can only be described as an impressionist painting created by light and the optimism of a guy who spent 450 Canadian dollars on it. But what if you suspect that vintage lenses are just a trend? Rose-colored glasses for pretentious folks. And maybe a modern lens with character is better suited for you. Well, enter the Zeiss classic Distagon 35mm f2 from the mid-2000s. We can use it as a comparison benchmark, it being one of the finest modern 35mm lenses with character. And then we will see if you're more of a vintage person or you only think that you're a vintage person. The Flektagon. Possibly one of the most popular 35mm lenses bought on eBay. For one, it's still relatively cheap. They made a lot of those, so there's a lot of supply. And secondly, indie filmmakers are cheap bastards who often spend more on actors' makeup than their primary lens. One lens that isn't cheap is the Quinaron. They also made less of them. And if you want a clean copy that doesn't look like it has been stored in an ogre's butt crack, you will be paying for it. Its price is the same as a Leica R Elmerit. Now if you want a relatively well-priced lens with character, the Takumar isn't too bad. It does make sense that it's not super rare, and it's also not well known. So it doesn't end up in the greasy, slimy digits of many filmmakers who made vintage Leica lenses unaffordable. As if Leica glass could fix composition errors. If one compares them with the Distagon, one will notice that the vintage glass has a lot more contrast. Either that, or the Distagon lets in more light at every aperture. But if you look at the tiny leaf, you will notice the exposure doesn't vary. Interesting if you're a lens nerd. However, the story continues. What about bokeh balls? Also called bubble bokeh. Also called Sicilian Swiss cheese. Also called lens pimples. Also called photographer's herpes. With the Flektagon only having 6 aperture blades, the octagonal bokeh is starting to become noticeable when closing down. But what about the Quinaron? Its bubble bokeh has very interesting sharp contours. I would even say it's very pleasant to look at. However, one stop down you will once see again octagonal shapes, but not as pronounced at f4 as the Flektagon. Now what about the Takumar? I can detect a slight stronger onion ringing at the bokeh balls wide open, but it's still not bad. Very interesting, at f4 it still has no octagonal shapes due to its 10 aperture blades. When overall compared to the Distagon, the first thing you notice is the similarity in bokeh balls between the Flektagon and the Distagon, as well as the Distagon having less contrast as well. Similarities change once the lens is closed down and the octagonal shapes rear its pointy heads. At f4 the Takumar is the one resembling the Distagon in bokeh balls. Now what about bokeh itself? The harsh mistress that seduces every lens enthusiast and leaves him without a penny. The Flektagon is an interesting case. For a vintage lens it's good and modern-like, which is another way of saying it ironically might not have enough character to blow you away. Something that a Quinaron doesn't have an issue with. The bokeh is incredibly charming yet clean. It has character while remaining precise. Now if we are talking about having the precision of an acid trip, the Takumar has to step forward, slurring its speech. But what it says is that it looked at its own schlong and it's winking at him. And all you will say is, "Right on, sir, you are a giant among men." That is how much character this lens has. So what about center sharpness when compared to the Distagon? The Distagon is a very sharp lens, as sharp as a Sharpie writing sharp on a box of razors. The Flektagon is coming second, holding its own. Interestingly, at F2.8 the precision of the Quinaron matches the Distagon, which is very impressive. At f4 the sharpness is all about the same, but the bokeh actually looks best on the Quinaron. For people who only shoot wide open, this is what you can expect from each lens. Obviously, the modern Distagon has the smoothest bokeh, but is it interesting bokeh for you? You decide. And now we get to focus breathing. The thing that is important to most filmmakers, and the thing that 99% of reasonable viewers couldn't give a shit about. An interesting disconnect between the two groups. Viewers say, stop making reboots, create original characters and interesting story. The film industry responds with, we heard you, so lenses have no film breathing in our new movie Spider-Man 8, Peter Dead Horse Beater. My point is, it doesn't really matter, but if you must know, take a look. The lens breathing is fairly the same. Now some of you might say, weird filmmaker,
Professionals care about lens breathing because minimal lens breathing is the industry standard. You're just coping since you can't afford Cineglass.
First of all, that attitude is the reason why your prostitute talks behind your back, and it ain't pretty, Mr. Mashed Baby Carrot. Second of all, name one movie that you hated because of lens breathing. Even you as a viewer wouldn't really care unless you have a mental defect. So if you want to ball wash some corporate producers, do it somewhere else. Having said all that, the lens breathing of the Takumar looks actually more appealing. Now the next stop is focus pulling while looking at the lens flares. I combined them both because this video is getting freaking long and I still have other projects to do. So lens flares you can analyze with your beady little eyeballs. Now what of the Flektagon? It's fairly easy to focus, not as smooth as the others, but its long rotation makes up for it. The Quinaron is actually very easy to focus. Its rotation is very long and it's the smoothest pulling lens on here. The lens flare is a bit more pronounced than the Flektagon. Then again, it could be just the way the light hits. After all, the sun doesn't stand still. Also, since this is the earlier Chrome version, I do not know if the later Zebra version of the Quinaron focus pulls better or worse. Since the Zebra looks more simplified, it's hard to tell. Then again, vintage lenses can be as fickle as a brunette telling you, maybe later. The Takumar also isn't bad to focus pull. However, it pulls the opposite way Nikon style because... what can you do, such as life? Its lens flaring isn't bad either. Look, all the lens flaring looks about the same. It's a spherical design. You want something else, get anamorphic. Then you get that horizontal streak stuff that is very distracting but no one wants to admit because it's the same industry standard rant again. Ultimately, the thing that should wow you on the Takumar is the bokeh. Interestingly, the Distagon was the trickiest to focus pull. It has the shortest rotation and it took me multiple tries to track that dummy, which made me feel like the dude in the center. Glassy-eyed, staring at broken dreams floating tits up in a river of despair. So keep that in mind when you go with the modern small lenses who tend to have shorter rotation. Also, again, look at the colors. It's definitely less contrasty than the vintage stuff. Then again, you might like it for color grading. For the few photographers that stuck around, here's some pictures taken with the Lumix G9 and Metabones XL. What can I say about the Flektagon? Well, it's sharp, it's contrasty, it's very light. Photographers tend to care about lightness. Leica guys are the worst offenders. They can't shut up about lightness. Also, they don't like to bend at the knees either, since their photos tend to be angled where they are standing. $5,000 lenses used for bland tourist angles. However, you can buy already a Flektagon for around $400 Canadian, so it's a budget-friendly option when you want to take pics of your bubble tea. What can I say about the Quinaron? It has the nicest rendering for photos, I think, and attached to your camera it will look sophisticated like jewelry. It's also a pleasure to manual focus, so your hairy palms don't have to sweat like a Hollywood producer doing a bad pee-pee touch trial. The price of the legal consultation would be similar to the Quinaron on eBay. And what can I say about the Takumar for photos? If you like things to be occasionally in focus, this isn't your lens. Not sure why I can focus this so much better for video, but for photos, wide open, it's usually as hazy as a memory of a politician after he got caught wearing ethnic face on Halloween. What about a Distagon? For photos, it's optically clean and almost perfect. If you want image with character without sacrificing optics, this is your lens. Ugh. Look at Augie. You usually just see those beady eyes on cocktail shrimp. For anyone new, this is Augie, our male model. He looks like a forest goblin who got sodomized in the face with a hammer. Because if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a stupid idiot.
But yesterday a pretty lady winked at me.
Was she epileptic?
Yes.
Alright, 40 minutes in and I'm still looking at Augie. This is not a fun day. However, lenses only matter if it can make human subjects look good. Or in this case, a close approximation of a mangled gargoyle whose penis broke off. So with the Flektagon, everything looks contrasty and in order. Once you look at the Quinaron, you notice the Flektagon has more of a crop. Since the Takumar and Distagon have the same crop as the Quinaron, I shall blame the Flektagon. Also, Megatron, Polygon, Ultron, the Movietron, Wonton soup. Not that it really matters, since this footage is shot with the GH5S and Metabone Speed Booster XL, making these lenses effectively 40mm. Interestingly, the Takumar is even less sharp and contrasty in long distances, but in a way that is very pleasantly vintage. Again, in this contest, vintage flaws can be actually a plus. So what do we know about far distances when compared with the Distagon? Well, we know that the Flektagon seems to be the most contrasty of all the lenses, regardless of aperture. If you like vibrant colors, the Flektagon is the way to go. It's not just good for a vintage lens, but good for any era lens. What about medium distance for lenses? The Flektagon looks virtually modern, except unlike most modern lenses, the skin tones don't look like shit. It has sharpness and good texture. That's something you don't see very often as a combo. Now I will say this, the bokeh on the Flektagon looks very unremarkable. It's not smooth enough to look modern, but it's not vintage enough to really be that interesting. Again, if you are looking for image quality and color in a vintage lens, the Flektagon might be as good as it gets. What about the Quinaron? Very nice skin tones and the rendering of its dimensions look fantastic. Bokeh looks interesting but not distracting. And at f2.8 wide open it's already quite sharp. Most likely the best balanced vintage lens among the bunch. The Quinaron's micro contrast also matches the Distagon, which is very impressive. Tonality is something the Distagon still excels at compared to the Flektagon. And now the Takumar. It oozes cinematic character like a 7-foot mime with permanent diarrhea who has to stop a terrorist from blowing up a toilet paper factory in Bangladesh. Its optical look is the closest resemblance to classic movie lenses. It's like moving art. And at f4 you can still get a modern look if you desire. In many ways, those features make the Takumar the most versatile lens for projects, being able to switch from painterly to clean just by stopping down. When compared to Distagon, what do we see? At f2.4 the Flektagon has the best image quality, edging out the Distagon in contrast. At f2.8 the Quinaron looks the most pleasant. However, at distances the Quinaron seems to have less bokeh. So it seems to be a matter of if you prefer rendering dimensions or bokeh strength. At f4 sharpness looks to be the same. At that point they all look modern. It should be pointed out that at f4 the Takumar lets in a lot less light. As for the close medium shots, now we get to see what skin tones really are about. As for the Flektagon, regardless if at f2.4 at f4, the color and sharpness is great without making the skin too clinical and unpleasant. Something that modern lenses like Sigma is suffering from. Yes, that's right, I'm shitting on the popular Sigma lenses. They make your actor's skin look like crap, and to compensate, you have to put a softening filter on it. And now you have a lens that doesn't render organically and isn't detailed. But at least it has a zoom, so you don't have to move your fat ass. As for the Quinaron, it has the most pleasant look of all of them. It's sharp, but not too sharp. Bokeh isn't distracting, but is memorable. And Augie is a hideous man. Nurses have a desire to shove his face with preparation H. Also, every time he walks by a toilet, it flushes automatically. In short, Augie is so hideous, his own portraits hang themselves. And now the Takumar. This distance shows why you're looking at an image that is special. It's sharp enough that it doesn't look like that hazy Soviet Union shit, but its ethereal rendering gives you an oil painting-like vibe. That is what you want to be looking for in a vintage lens, if you value the overused term character. And again, at f4 the Takumar is clean enough that you can shoot even high clinical antiseptic topics that are non-offensive in story with sterile characters. In other words, contemporary Disney shows. When compared with the Distagon, we can see that the Distagon is edging out the Flektagon in pleasant bokeh and detail at f2.5. And at f2.8, the Quinaron again has the most pleasant and interesting rendering. And f4 really drives the point home that vintage lenses have more contrast than the Zeiss Classic. But for color grading, that might not always be the best thing. What about close-ups? You see the Flektagon is the clear winner, showing Augie's suction cup eyeball. Having said all that, none of this matters until we show how those lenses perform in a cinematic film scene. Well, wonder no more. instead of vintage, should you just buy a Distagon? If you like excellent image quality of a modern lens but still want some character, all you really need is a Distagon. Don't get vintage just because it's the popular trend among people needing a personality. The Flektagon is the flip side of that. If you want character in your lens but still some modern-like image quality, the Zeiss Jena is the way to go. It's a good budget alternative for a modern lens that looks interesting. Well, budget until cheap bastard filmmakers jack up the price on eBay. The Auto-Quinaron is the best all-around balanced vintage lens I have used in a 35mm. I was so tempted to declare it the winner, since it makes images as nice as a beta orbiter buying flowers for a lady that can't remember his name. It actually has become my go-to lens at 35mm for good clean vintage footage. But the winner is the Takumar 35mm F2.3. This is about finding the best vintage lens. And the criteria is to have the most vintage feel without looking like it has been filmed through a maxi pad. This is the best vintage lens for me, hands down. Funny thing is, this review footage has been filmed already last year in the fall of 2021. I just got really busy with other film projects that also make no money, so I only recorded the audio until now. Last year I sold the Distagon and Flektagon, even though they were really good lenses. But the Auto-Quinaron, and especially this Takumar, I would probably never sell. Okay, Augie, for the next shot, you swing the katana as fast as you can towards your crotch. But for safety reasons, when I say stop, you have to stop. Sounds all good to me. And now. Ah! That hit me right in the buttocks. Ah! At least I missed my minuscule balls, but still it hurts. Ah! And stop.